Hi, my name's Renata. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm an intercultural trainer, communication skills coach, and foreign language teacher. Therefore, on my YouTube channel, I have a lot of videos about these topics: intercultural communication, expat life, language learning, how to communicate successfully across cultures. This particular video is about direct and indirect communication. I think this is the biggest source of misunderstandings when we communicate across cultures. So I thought I'd make a video about this topic, and I hope you'll find it very informational and can learn a lot in order to communicate more successfully without misunderstandings across cultures. If you've watched my videos before, you know that most of the time I'll be sharing slides, so I'll be sharing my slides from now on, but you'll see me again at the end of this video. So in this video, I want to discuss how to better understand direct and indirect communication, and I want to cover a little bit about the origins and the definitions. What other names are there for these styles of communication? I want to spend a lot of time on examples and dialogues so that you can understand the difference and then summarize that in a comparison. I also want to talk a little bit about direct and indirect feedback, separate from communicating directly or indirectly in general. And I want to close with some advantages of both direct and indirect communication, because most people find either one or the other better or worse. I really want to convince you that there is no better, worse, just different, and that both communication styles have their distinct advantages. But let's start with origins and definitions. Where does this expression come from, direct, indirect communication, and what other terminology is there? Well, we can say this goes back to Edward T. Hall, a US American anthropologist and cross-cultural researcher who coined the expression low versus high context communication in his book Beyond Cultures in 1976. So as you can see, the expression or the terminology low context, high context communication has been around for quite a while. Over time, we've also come to say that, well, low context is direct communication, or we could say explicit communication, whereas high context communication is considered indirect or implicit communication. So you might see all these words or all this terminology in the media or in literature as you're studying maybe this topic, just to know there's one side and the other, but there's different words, there are different expressions for the two different communication styles. According to Edward T. Hall, he defined it back in that book in 1976 as follows. A high context communication or message is one in which most of the information is already in the person, while very little is in the coded, explicit, transmitted part of the message. A low context communication is just the opposite, meaning the mass of the information is vested in the explicit code. Now, if you go like, what? Okay, here's what this means. If you and I communicate and we share a cultural background, and that might be a national cultural background, a generational cultural background, a gender cultural background, a professional or company background that we share, like corporate culture. We share a common background. So we use a lot of non-verbal communication, body language, behavior, facial expressions, and all that. And you would understand me without me having to use a lot of spoken words. So that means there's a lot of context between us. So that's high context. And when there's high context, the actual spoken word, well, it's important, but it's not the most important thing. And I don't have to say that much because there's a lot already in the context that we share between the two of us. That's what it means, that there's a lot of information already in the person. Whereas explicit communication means we don't share much of that background. So my body language or my gestures, my behavior may even confuse you, or you may not what it means. So I'm being very explicit in my verbal expressions. I'm using a lot more words. Maybe I'm saying it three, four, five times. I'm summarizing, structuring, saying it again, maybe even writing it down. So that's typical for explicit or direct communication because we assume we don't share a lot of context. That's the difference. But in order to understand, I thought I want to show you through a lot of dialogues and examples. So here is our first situation. If you would like the room temperature to be cooler, do you use some paper as a fan and you you pretend that you're hot using the paper as a fan and you look at the air conditioning display and you say, "Oof, what temperature does it say it is?" Or do you say, "It's too hot in here. Can we please lower the temperature?" You don't use any body language, you only use your words. Which of the two is more like you? First or the second? I know. Here comes the, oh, it depends. I hear that a lot. You know why? Because we are capable of both direct and indirect communication. We're flexible creatures. We can adapt, we can adjust. But we have preferences. So, what is your personal preference? What sounds more like you? What comes more natural to you? What's your first idea of communicating you want the room to be cooler? You just say it, or you try a slightly more indirect or high context communication strategy? That will be the first one. Whereas the second one is an example for direct or low context communication. At the same time, the person listening to you, is that person going to understand what you're trying to communicate? So if you use the indirect or high context communication strategy, do they actually know what that means? So how would they react to it? Maybe they just tell you what it says. Maybe they say, "Oh, it says this and that temperature on the AC display." And you're like, "Uh-huh, that's not what I wanted. Why don't you understand what I want?" Well, then the other person most definitely is a direct or low context communicator, and you should have said what you want directly using your words, like, "Please lower the temperature. It's too hot in here for me." On the other hand, if you are direct and you say it directly with your words, the other person may feel, "Ooh, you could have said that nicer. What about me? Maybe I like the temperature, so don't you even care about me?" So the other person might have very different thoughts on their mind. So I often get the question, so which one is better? Well, we're back to square one where I have to say there is no better or worse, there's just different. And luckily, we are flexible and adaptable creatures, and we have to find out what's the better way to do it in this particular situation with this particular person, or sometimes even with the entire culture that we're dealing with. Here's another situation. Let's say you are offered some wine, and let's assume you really want some. So your answer is yes, 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 yes. What do you say? Do you say, "Oh no, you shouldn't open a bottle just for me"? Or do you say, "Yes, please"? Which is your preferred approach? Which is direct and which is indirect? I hope you guessed right. This is indirect, this is direct. Which is better or worse? None. They're just different. And you have to see the advantages and disadvantages of either strategy. Now, if you are invited by somebody who knows and loves and appreciates indirect or high context communication, who comes from the same cultural background or shares the same context with you, then, "Oh no, you shouldn't open a bottle just for me," would be understood as, "Yes, I would like some. I just don't want to be a bother, but if you can open it, yes, I would love to." So they would understand that. Whereas if your host is direct or comes from a low context communication culture, they might even say, "Okay, fine, then I'm not going to open it." And you're like, "What? No, I wanted some." So, and On the other hand, if you say yes, please too quickly, in some cultures that is considered impolite. You should say, "Oh no, I don't know. Oh, if it's not too much of a bother. Oh, maybe I shouldn't." You should kind of refuse two or three times, and they will keep offering, and then you can say, "Ah, it's really not too much of a bother. I'll take one, just a little bit, thank you." So, how much of the indirect communication do you do, or how direct can you be? This, believe me, is the main source of misunderstanding in intercultural business, intercultural communication, or international business. I've seen this so many times, and it's really important that you develop a sense of what is appropriate where in order not to have the situation of a misunderstanding. Let's have a look at another situation. So here's a conversation between a boss and a worker. The boss says, "We just got a huge and lucrative order. So we need to step up production. I need a few people to come in next Saturday and Sunday. Those who come in will get paid 50% extra for the weekend. Will you come?" The worker says, "Oh, that's really good news, boss. We're lucky to work for you. You're very generous and kind. It's my daughter's birthday on Sunday. The whole family's coming. Our house will be very busy and loud with all those visitors, lots of food, music, and dance. We also have to invite neighbors." The boss says, "Oh, wow, that sounds exhausting. I can see that you're eager to get away from all that noise. So, can I count on you to come on Saturday and Sunday? This way you can make a lot of extra money for your family and still join them for dinner. With all those visitors, they won't even notice that you're gone during the day." The worker then says, "It's really an important day for my daughter. Thank you so much for your kind understanding." The boss says, "Okay, great. See you on Saturday." The worker just smiles and leaves. Now, here's my question for you. Is the worker going to come on Saturday? Yes or no? Why? Why not? Take a moment to think. So, what's it going to be? Is the worker going to come? No. The worker clearly said that he or she won't come. Really? Did the worker do that? Did you miss anything? Where did the worker say that? Are you more of a direct or more of an indirect communicator? If you're more of an indirect communicator, you would have understood that. If you're more of a direct communicator, you're completely surprised by the no. If you thought the worker's going to come, like the boss, then you're a direct communicator. So our boss is definitely a direct or a low context communicator. And the worker here is a high context or indirect communicator. So the worker doesn't want to come because it's his or her daughter's birthday. And what seems like a nuisance and exhausting to the boss, like for the whole weekend, lots of guests are coming, the house will be full, even the neighbors are coming. For the boss, it's like, "Oh, you're probably happy to get away." But what the worker was trying to say is, this is a special event. It's for the whole weekend, it's Saturday and Sunday, and that's why I can't come. Um, and that wasn't understood. So I hope this dialogue shows you that direct versus indirect communication can lead to misunderstandings. And it's not that one wanted to trick the other. I sometimes get that as feedback from the clients I work with or the students I teach, that they say, "Well, the worker wasn't honest. The worker should have said directly that he or she doesn't want to come or can't come." Well, that's not so easy if you're an indirect communicator, and maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe there's a little bit of a power distance, cultural dimension going on here where the worker really appreciates the boss because there's a great offer. Wow, 50% extra. I'm sure the worker really means that this is good news and that they're lucky to work for this boss and so on and so forth. But the worker just can't come that weekend. It's just the special event. That's it. But doesn't want to be impolite. And we're back to that square one, let's say, where people often say, well, we just need to be polite, but what is polite? Do you consider it to be polite to say the truth and nothing but the truth, very honest and direct, even if it hurts? Or do you consider it to be polite to kind of indicate that it might be troublesome and hoping the other person gets it, can read between the lines, and you don't have to say it so explicitly because you don't want to hurt them? That's the big question. What is polite? It's not such an easy, straightforward thing to say. Well, here's another situation. Dialogue 1 and 2 about a dirty car. A says, oh, wow, our car is dirty. In the first dialogue, A is talking to B, and B says, yes, it is. The weather's been really bad. And that seems to be the end of the conversation. So A isn't happy. Maybe that's not what A wanted. So A goes on and talks to C and says again, oh, wow, our car's quite dirty. And then C says, yes, it is, but it's not my fault. And then A says, oh, no, 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 that's not what I meant. I just realized it's dirty. And then C says, oh, yeah, it sure is. I always wash it when I drive it through mud. And A says, yes, you do. That's very nice of you. Okay, what's going on here? Are you confused a little, or do you know exactly what's going on here? Well, if you're an indirect communicator, if you can read between the lines, you may get the feeling that A wants somebody to wash the car. It's just that A doesn't say it so directly. So A here is very high context or indirect, just pointing at the car that it's dirty. Whereas B is very low context, doesn't understand it as could you please wash the car or could someone please wash the car? Because in low context or direct communication, that would require the explicit words, can you please wash the car? And A did not say that. So B doesn't feel that this is what A wanted to say, just takes it as a statement and says, yeah, sure, I guess it's because the weather's been really bad. That's it, end of story. But in dialogue 2, A communicates with another high context indirect communicator. And that's the most dangerous thing when two high context or two indirect communicators talk to each other because they will both bring their very own interpretations, their very own context into the conversation. Now, A goes in with the intention to find somebody to wash the dirty car, but C feels accused of having been the person who dirtied the car. But C says that it was not my fault. So there's an immediate sense of I have to defend myself. This was an accusation. See how much people can interpret into statements, and you go like, oh no, that's not what I wanted. So you're completely misunderstood. That was never your intention. And I hope that shows you how much direct versus indirect communication can lead to misunderstandings. I want to give you one more example, one more situation with a direct and an indirect communicator. This time, again, at work, we have a manager and we have two employees, employee A and B. So the manager says to employee B, do you happen to know employee A? And B says, of course, I've worked closely with him. I know him very well. So the manager wants to know more and says, he would be a great project manager, and I want to offer him that position. What do you think? And then B says, yes, certainly, you should consider him as well as consider others. Now the manager is confused. He says, why others? What do you mean by that? Is he not the right person for the job? And then B comes up with that story. You know, there's some girls who fall in love with a boy who's very popular, well dressed, and good looking. After they get married, they realize that they made a mistake because the boy has no substance. Other girls will look for a guy with good character, check out his family, and talk to his friends. When they get married, these girls are much happier than the girl who married the popular guy. The manager is totally confused. What does that have to do with employee A? Why are you avoiding my question? And B is like, no, no, I'm not avoiding the question. I'm very happy to help. But the manager says, you're not helping at all. I'm quite disappointed. I'll ask someone else who really knows employee A. Why didn't you just say that you actually know nothing about him? At least that would have been honest. And B says, I'm very sorry. I really just wanted to help. So what happened here? Um, what is the reason for this type of miscommunication? Any ideas? And who's the direct, who's the indirect communicator? Well, if you said the manager is the direct or low context communicator, you were right. And employee B is our high context or indirect communicator. Our direct communicator wanted a straightforward answer. Would employee A be a good candidate for that project manager position? Yes or no? What do you think? But employee B, as a very, very indirect communicator, that's kind of almost an extreme example. Let's say, can't just say, yes, he's great, or no, I don't think you should. So employee B comes up with a story that seems completely unrelated at first. But if you're an indirect communicator, you would see that the girl who's happier when she marries a guy after she checked out the good character, the family situation, and the friends, rather than the girl going for the good-looking, well-dressed, popular guy. Well, you would see that this is a comparison to employee A. Employee A is the very popular, well-dressed, and good-looking guy that some girls would marry, but then they're not happy. They're disappointed when they marry him. So, what B is trying to tell the manager here is, why don't you look at all the candidates and do a thorough background check? You may possibly see that employee A isn't the best choice, but employee B is such an indirect communicator that he or she couldn't say it that way. Instead, came up with that story. And if you are a very direct communicator, you absolutely don't get it. On the contrary, the manager felt that employee B was avoiding the question, that employee B doesn't actually really know anything about employee A, and that was a useless comment, and that the manager needs to ask someone else. And B is kind of heartbroken, keeps saying, I really wanted to help, which is probably true. Terrible misunderstanding, isn't it? So let's look at the comparison between those two different communication styles. Direct communication or explicit or low context communication is a very direct verbal interaction. You put a lot of the information in the actual spoken words more than non-verbal or body language or gestures or behavior. You really focus on the spoken word. That there are hidden messages is absolutely not expected. People really listen for the spoken word, and that's it. Um, People with an individual identity uh, and who love speaking up would probably value direct communication a lot. This communication style relies on facts and linear logic. Therefore, a no is a no and a yes is a yes. It uses highly structured messages with very precise details. You pack a lot of verbal information into it, and you can take the meaning literally. And that is very highly valued when you do that. Also, written informations in contracts are trusted because that's the precise written information. No interpretation needed. On the other hand, indirect or implicit communication or high context communication uses indirect verbal interaction. It means it uses words, but it also focuses heavily on things that are not being said, on non-verbal language, body language, gestures, behavior, and so on. We have a lot of context that we use, and we do expect hidden messages. People are expected to know how to read between the lines. There's sort of a group identity and some face saving that is highly valued in that communication style, and it relies on that context. We need to establish what context we share, and then we use some sort of non-linear logic to communicate. As it comes to yes and no, no's are sometimes avoided in indirect communication. You find another way, like a story, a very confusing story, instead of just saying no. And you may get a yes that doesn't really mean a yes, because yes can simply mean, yes, I hear you. Yes, I understand this is important. But it may not mean, yes, I will do it. Also, non-contexted messages that provide room for interaction are highly valued, because there is already a lot of context. So the messages that you say, the spoken language can be very non-contexted and very limited, reduced to very few words. And in indirect communication, good relationships and verbal agreements are highly trusted. So I hope you start seeing the difference between the two. And I also want to discuss what the difference is between a personal preference and maybe a country comparison. So I'm pretty sure by now, as you're listening to this, you know what your personal preference is. And maybe you're wondering, can an entire country have a preference? Yes, that's possible. That's what happens in intercultural communication research, and something you will find in books like The Culture Map by Erin Mayer. In this book that I can highly recommend, especially when you're looking for lots of situational approaches and stories that relate to business situations, then you'll find those sliding scales that come from research, asking hundreds and thousands of people for their preferences, trying to see if there's a pattern in the same country that's different from a pattern in another country. Of course, not every human being is like that. And if you live in a low context culture, but you personally are more of a high context person, well, you'll have a hard time, but you've probably learned how to deal with it. And this is exactly what we do in cross-cultural communication. We just learn how to deal with it, how to get adjusted. But yes, you can put countries on that sliding scale, and you see a couple of countries here, and you can find that in Erin Mayer's book, The Culture Map, on page 39. This is from where I've taken this graphic. There's another one I've taken from her book that I wanted to show here from page 72, which brings together two elements, the low versus high context orientation, as well as how positive you feel about giving negative feedback directly. So if we combine these two, we get a really, really interesting picture, because if it's a low context or explicit culture, meaning things are said very directly, then you would expect that negative feedback is also given very directly. But and that would be quadrant C. But we have countries that are considered low context or explicit, but they're very, and sorry, that would be quadrant A. And then if they're indirect, that would be quadrant C. Same applies for indirect or implicit cultures. So if you're indirect in your general communication, people would think that you're also indirect with your negative feedback. That's quadrant D. But surprise, surprise, there's also a quadrant B where we find high context cultures that have a tendency to give negative feedback very directly. And this is why I want to cover the topic of giving negative feedback towards the end of this video as a special topic, in addition to just direct and indirect communication. So there's something called the feedback sandwich, and I'm pretty sure you've heard of that. There's this type of sandwich, which has a little bit of an introduction and context at the beginning, but the vast majority of the sandwich is clear, explicit, detailed, negative feedback. You say it as it is. And then, yes, of course, a little bit of a motivational encouragement at the end, but not too much. There's also the just the bacon method, no bread at all. But that's something you find only in a handful of countries and cultures. It's definitely very, very hard to swallow for most other cultures. But if you come from a country or culture where indirect negative feedback is more common, you want to go for the negative feedback sandwich, like this, where you have a lot of praise, flattery, and positive feedback. So there's a lot more bread than meat, let's put it that way. There's careful, constructive feedback in the middle, followed by soft and indirect language, and at the end, of course, some motivational encouragement. So if that's the case, you should never use this type of sandwich where you have a lot of very direct and explicit negative feedback in the middle and very little bread. That wouldn't go down well. So at the end of this video, like I promised, I want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of direct and indirect communication, because neither of them is better or worse. I really want to come back to that statement as often as I can. They're just different. So, what are some advantages of direct communication? How can it help? Well, it can lower the risk of misunderstanding factual information because remember, the actual spoken words, there's a lot of them, and we go into a lot of detail. So there's a lot of factual information provided. That lowers the risk of misunderstanding. Numbers, facts, details, deadlines, and so on. Also, it can be fast because you say yes or no, and then we move on. We don't have to go around in circles for a long time until we figure out who really wants what. No, we say exactly what we want, and then we move on. So it can save time. Direct communication actually helps with fast communication. And because of that, there could be higher efficiency in problem solving or conflict resolution. We make a quick decision, we move quick, we know exactly what to do. It's very explicit. But there are distinct advantages of indirect communication as well. Indirect communication can help you handle sensitive topics without putting relationships at risk. Direct communication can ruin relationships if you don't have the same understanding of what is acceptable in direct communication. You can ruin a good business or private relationships. So indirect communication can handle those rather sensitive topics much better. Also, it gives an opportunity to gain time and mend differences. Sometimes maybe we just need to wait a little while, see how things go, then make a decision. So indirect communication can help us do that. And finally, gives us the flexibility to explore alternative options while maintaining harmony. These are very, very important points, especially in international negotiation. So I'd like you to look at direct versus indirect communication, not as better or worse, but it's just different and more suitable for one or the other situation. And once again, just being polite, respectful, and honest is not going to help. I kept talking about it and I wanted to say it again because we all have very different ideas of what is polite, what is respectful, and what is honest as we communicate more directly or more indirectly. Now, how can you handle direct and indirect communication if you notice the other person has a different preference? Well, first of all, you have to become aware of your own preference. So I hope this video has helped you to become aware of what your very personal preference is. Then you can try to see the advantages of the other preference. I gave you 3 each, so try to see those advantages of the one that you don't like that much. That can help you to find common grounds and ways to compromise, while at the same time you're acknowledging the other person's preference rather than idealizing your own and condemning the other person's. Try not to do that. It's not helping. By doing that, hopefully, you come to the very, very important step number 4. You realize there's no better or worse, just different. And yes, I'm saying it again because it is very different, very important. Last step would be that you collaborate better with others and you achieve goals faster by developing a curiosity for different, not a fear, but a curiosity, by building an understanding for others and thus stretching your comfort zone. So these are my recommendations of handling direct versus indirect communication whenever you see a difference in your daily life or in your business practices. And just remember, everything is just a question of perception. The good old story of 2 detectives looking at a number on the floor, while the detective on the left will say, "This is number 6." The detective on the right will say, "No, you are wrong. This is number 9." So who is right and who is wrong? There's no better or worse. Remember, there's no right or wrong. They're just looking at it from a different perspective. So we all have this question of perception. And if you're curious and want to learn more about these very basics of intercultural communication, this question of perception, I have another video. And in that video, it's the introduction to intercultural communication. I explore this question of perception. So after watching this video, go ahead and find the other one, Introduction to Intercultural Communication, that can help you understand why it's so important to understand that question of perception and to ask why. If you want to know more or contact me directly, you can find me online by looking for my name, Renate Urban, or the name of my business, Urban Training and Services. You can visit my website, or you can contact me on LinkedIn. You can send me a direct message there. This is the end of the video about direct and indirect communication. I hope you very much enjoyed it. If you feel like you want to prepare for a negotiation or for communicating with others, if you have situations in your life where you want to work with a coach, help you communicate better across cultures, please contact me and set up a one-on-one session with me. I'd love to help you communicate more successfully across cultures. If you like my videos, please come back to my channel and subscribe and watch out for new videos coming up every week. Thank you for joining the community. Stay tuned. See you again soon. Goodbye.